Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu and I'm back with another channel update video. I recently just hit 1,000 subscribers, so this is going to be my 1,000 subscriber special. It took me about a year to a year and a half to get to this point, and it really does mean a lot to me because it is very hard to get to 1,000 subscribers, and I want to take this time to thank everyone for their support and their continued support, as it does really mean a lot to me because I never thought I'd get this far. So for my 1,000 subscriber special, I thought it would be really interesting to give some more insight on who I am and what I have done. So just as a quick TCG background check, I started playing TCGs when I was very, very young, and Pokemon was my first TCG, and I played Pokemon all the way up until Yu-Gi-Oh! Came out, and then I switched from Pokemon to Yu-Gi-Oh! And then I played Yu-Gi-Oh! For the majority of my high school and middle school life. And basically when I started entering and transitioning into college is when I got into Magic the Gathering. Then I kind of just played Magic the Gathering for a while, and then I switched from Magic the Gathering to Force of Will. So while I was playing Force of Will is when I got some connections built up, and that landed me my job at ARG to make Argent Saga. So I was still kind of playing Force of Will and Argent Saga at the same time. And then once Force of Will kind of just was not the game for me anymore, just for a whole bunch of various reasons, is when I switched from Force of Will to Buddy Fight while I was still working on Argent Saga, so I guess I was also playing Argent Saga kind of at the same time. And then after my work on Argent Saga concluded and Buddy Fight ended is when I was kind of just looking for a new TCG to play, and here comes Digimon to fill the exact gap that I was looking for. So you could kind of say I'm really well adversed in a whole bunch of TCGs. I have played a little bit of a whole bunch of other TCGs because it was just part of my research while I was working on Argent Saga, just to kind of see what other card games are doing and seeing if there's anything in those that I can incorporate into Argent Saga. Which brings me to my main point, which is my work on Argent Saga. So this is going to be my Argent Saga post-mortem because unfortunately earlier this year, Argent Saga announced that it is ceasing its development and production, and while I do think it's quite unfortunate, it's something that I can't say I didn't expect. So just to put things into perspective, Argent Saga was a trading card game that came out about a year and a half ago, so it was 2019 Gen Con was when the game first released, and I worked on basically sets 2 through sets 4, and set 4 is when I left the company just because of various reasons, but regardless what those reasons were, I worked on the vast majority of the game. So what is Argent Saga? Argent Saga is basically a game designed by players for players, where the whole idea of its inception was the fact that it was just taking a whole bunch of really good elements from a whole bunch of games and then fusing them all into one game for a brand new experience. So that is what the design and the development team side was thinking, but my boss had a different idea on why Argent Saga was even being made to begin with. So my boss, who ran ARG, short for Alter Reality Games, he basically was running tournaments for a whole bunch of different games for a very long time, and he was really sick and tired of how big companies were treating him. So he basically kind of wanted to experiment by making his own trading card game to spite the others to see if he could run a card game more successfully than the other companies. The only problem was that ARG was a small company and it didn't exactly have the budget to go toe-to-toe with larger companies. So he saved up a lot of money from running the events to fund Argent Saga with, and it started off on a relatively successful note despite its early woes. So, as I mentioned, I came in at the start of the development of Set 2. So, Set 2 was in development before Set 1 was even out yet, so I was trying to change Set 1 as much as I possibly could, and unfortunately, I really wasn't allowed to change a whole lot because it was kind of already locked in. So, just from my initial early testing of Set 1, we came to the conclusion that the set with the starter decks was very, very control focused. And my boss was trying to push fast and aggressive games just because he's coming from a more business and TO perspective, where fast games means fast rounds and fast rounds means fast events. So that was his mind, but what was given to me to try to work on and tweak to fit that goal was the complete opposite because it was a control-based set. And then to make matters worse, my boss was pushing cards out slightly earlier than intended just to make a couple of more additional sales or to try to push the sales of the first set forward. And this definitely did not help because it introduced cards into an environment that was not being tested on, and it made the control aspect of the first booster set even worse than it was in testing. So as a result, the first couple events just took really, really long, and this kind of made my boss extra agitated because he was under the impression that games were supposed to end quickly. And then on top of this, we also had a couple of printing errors because we were working with Cardamundi, and the department that we were working on with Cardamundi to print our cards was giving us a new representative to work with. So not only was this our first attempt at a TCG, but it was the representative that we were working with at Cardamundi's first TCG that they were working on. So the number of printing errors for the first part of the first booster set was numerous before we had to cease production temporarily and basically try to have them fix all of the mistakes that they were making. So while the game's early showcasing was really, really positive and the sales were decent early on, that would soon start to fade between all of the negative stigma that the game was getting just from its first booster set because the meta in the first booster set was not very good, and it definitely put a lot of players off from continuing to want to get into the game. On top of which, one of the things that my boss was also really trying to push was he wanted to have a product come out every single month, so that way players are still going to be spending something on Argent Saga every single month, so that way it acts as a constant revenue stream for the game, so that way we could continue to fund it, because the art was getting to be really, really expensive, and my boss also wanted to try to find different ways of reusing the art. So he was trying to come up with a whole bunch of different ways to not only just make sure we had a constant stream of revenue, but also try to not piss the players off for some of the actions that he was taking. And some of those attempts were better than others. So some of the early ideas that my boss was playing around with was just constant reprints of alternate versions of the card. So we would release a card in a base version, then we'd have a full art version, then we'd have a full art foil version, and it would all just to try to stretch and reuse the art as much as possible. And my boss also was playing with the constant idea of like this whole crush card virus idea. So like there was a card in Yu-Gi-Oh! Called Crush Card Virus, and for like when that card was made, it was just a very, very hard to get card where you basically had to be like insanely good at the game and win events to get your hands on it. And as such, it became a very highly sought after card, and it was a card in really high demand. So my boss was trying to manipulate the secondary market to basically plan around reusing that same idea. So he would release a card out, people would bitch and complain, and then he would say, oh, here it is somewhere else, and basically try to point the players to somewhere else. So most of this was in attempts to get players to play at LGSs. So it's like the top card would be really, really good, and it would force players to want to try to play in the event to get their hands on it. And then basically for those who couldn't, then he would release it somewhere else. And then basically that would entice the players to want to go to that somewhere else if they couldn't get it the initial time around. The only problem with this was it started to slowly create a really negative feedback loop in the players, because players who couldn't participate in the events couldn't get their hands on it the first time around, and then sometimes they wouldn't even bother just because with what was coming out in the future sets, the card might not have even been needed. So just the constant reusing and reprinting of cards definitely put a really negative feeling on the players to not want to invest in the game, because who's to say a card's actually going to hold any value, because it could get reprinted in a Heart's Notice. So this coupled with the poor performance of the meta in set 1 already started the game off on a very negative trend. And then as I was working on set 2, we also decided to come up with a new product, which was basically trying to take a page from LCGs, where it's basically just a pack of preset cards, and you just need to buy a couple of copies of the pack of preset cards, so that way you just have a full playset of all of the cards in that like miniature set. So while this was a really good idea, the execution was also really, really poor, just because what we were putting in that pack didn't create the value for the players to even want to like continue buying into that product, and we tried to release that type of a product multiple times just because we already had them designed and we just needed to push them out. So usually the format of those products would go like you have 5 reprint cards, then you have 5 preprint cards, which were cards that were going to be released in the future set, and then we have a couple of new cards to splash in between those. So again, this just created another negative feedback loop on why people are even bother buying these, and as we saw in later of this version of the product, then it just got worse and worse, and especially coupled with continued printing errors from Cardamundi, it definitely really put even more of a sour taste in players' mouths. And then going into set 2, knowing that set 1 was really control-based, we wanted to push more aggressive styles of play, so that way it fits more in line with my boss's perception on how he wants the game to be ran. So we definitely were trying to push how players wanted to play the game, and we definitely wanted the players to be more aggressive. So part of the goal was to make set 2 more aggressive, and set 2 was more aggressive, but in some of the wrong ways, because certain cards kind of just got overlooked, and they created some really unforeseen synergies, and those unforeseen synergies were kind of problematic, at least in the players' perspectives, even though that's kind of what we wanted in the end, was to allow more aggressive strategies to exist. It just was the way that it was handled that, again, just really didn't settle well with the players at all. And then while we were working on set 2, as set 1's meta was continued to develop, it developed in even more controlling and unhealthy play patterns. So it got to the point where we had to actually start suspending some cards. So suspending is just basically a temporary ban, and we had to put fixes in set 2 to try to better tackle the problems that were in set 1. So the fact that we already had to start banning cards from set 1 definitely was another huge problematic point that players definitely took note of. Some were really relieved just because, again, my boss decided to make some really, I guess, poor decisions pushing cards forward that he really shouldn't have. And again, that just created a huge unhealthy play pattern and unintended synergies really early on, and we just had to try to course correct as best as we can in set 2 while trying to push the aggression of set 2 forward. So set 2 had its own internal strife just because basically almost half of set 2 from when I was handed it basically had to be reworked because either the mechanics weren't very good or they were just continuing these unhealthy play patterns. One of the big things that I asked the lead designer was, why are you trying to put a better version of Dredge into the game? So for those who don't know, Dredge is a very powerful and problematic mechanic from Magic the Gathering, and basically the response that I got from the designer was he just wanted to see if he could make it better. And I'm just like, why are you trying to make a problematic game mechanic better? That was already really, really worrisome in terms of the level of work that I had to put in, and I basically had to scrap almost the entirety of half of set 2 and rework it from the ground up to be a little bit more in line with what we currently have and what our goals were. And then this also started some minor conflict between me and the lead designer because the lead designer was trying to push hyper-powerful mechanics on as early as he possibly can. And I'm just sitting there and I'm wondering, why are you even doing this when we're just trying to establish the game? Like, it just made no sense to me. So some of the designs that he was playing with just was very, very dangerous, and it definitely just caused a little bit of internal conflict between me and the designer. So when Set 2 finally gets printed and it finally is released, it's released kind of without a hitch, except the sales were not as good as Set 1's. So we definitely took notice that there was a drop in players and a drop in stores wanting to carry the product, and we just had to think how we could make the next set even better, so that way it would continue to attract more players and attract more stores. But when Set 2 was released, the meta was basically one of two decks. You're either playing this really hyper control deck, or you're playing this really fast aggressive deck. So every other deck kind of got shut out, and it was like a two-deck format, and it just, again, wasn't really solving many of the problems that Set 1 kind of laid out, except there is a total of one new aggro deck that actually is playable versus the, control decks that were just dominating the previous set. So the games were still taking way too long. They did shorten up just because of that aggro deck, and that aggro deck did end up helping, but for, again, the wrong reasons, just because of some of the unintended synergies that deck was doing that wasn't really healthy for the game. And then going into Set 3's development, my boss wanted to basically start trying to play with draft formats a little bit more. So going into Set 3, it was supposed to be a draftable set, and I looked at the set and I explained that, hey, this is not draftable. This set is not designed for draft. And the lead designer kind of replied where it's just like it wasn't meant to be draftable, and basically we were just tackling how to make this not draftable set draftable because it was already designed and it's not going to be completely redesigned just to incorporate draft. So we were just trying to figure out what we could do to make the set more draftable, and that was one of the big things we were pushing for Set 3. So one of the things that I started playing around with was designing my own set with the intention of it being draftable. So I didn't exactly lay out all of the rarities and ratios and do all of the math to make it draftable. I was just designing the cards so that they would work more in a draftable environment. So I was doing that kind of off in my own free time, and while we were just sitting in meetings for days and days trying to contemplate how to make a not draftable game draftable. And this really started agitating my boss even more, just because all of the solutions that me and my coworkers came up with were never good enough for him. So Set 3 had its own slew of changes that we had to make it more draftable, and then we also were trying to test different ways that the set could be drafted, and eventually we settled on the method that they currently have, and then that method would then be redone for Set 4, which was supposed to be the premier draft. So this was more of a test draft, and Set 4 was supposed to be more of the actual draft set. But on top of making the set draftable, we also had to make the set even more powerful to try to tackle some of the previous problems that the current meta was facing. So we also had to introduce some really powerful and new mechanics to just try to, again, push the aggression and make games end faster, and we were definitely playing with a lot of extra power that we probably didn't need to relatively quickly, and the game already started off at a really high power level. So with each passing set, we definitely had to increase the overall power level just because the systems and mechanics in place were not exactly functioning as intended, and we had to adjust it according to how players were actually playing the game. And then at the time of Set 3's development was when we had a whole bunch of internal issues. So we had a whole bunch of employees that just quit and leave working on the game, and this was more by their choice rather than my boss firing them, because my boss really didn't believe in firing people, so he just created a hostile environment where it enticed them to leave rather than him just straight up firing people. And then as more people were leaving, those people weren't going to be replaced just because the game wasn't doing super successful by Set 2's launch, because sales haven't been increasing, so he just felt like there was no need to replace the people that were leaving, and basically whoever was staying just had to start doing more and more work. My boss also wasn't making the smartest decisions on how he was utilizing social media, so we had a whole bunch of social media backlash, or at least he had more social media backlash. That definitely didn't help the game, just because he was acting pretty immature on social media and picking fights with some of the players that were only trying to play and support the game. Even though some of them was a little bit more warranted and some of them was a little bit more personal, he just still wasn't handling the situation correctly, and as it was all public, the community definitely saw and they definitely took note. So while he was trying to fix his social media backlash, he did manage to salvage it to a degree, and he also realized that he needed to hire more people to kind of just slowly try to replace the ones that left, because he still needs people to actually work on the game. So he hired about 2 new people versus like the 4 or 5 people that ended up leaving. So we were still operating on small numbers, and each person still had to do a lot more than what they normally would have if we would have been more staffed. So as Set 2's meta was starting to form, because it was still just a freshly released set, we were still working on Set 3, and it was around this time where I was suspended from continuing to work on Set 3, because I was having more disagreements with the lead designer, and my boss really didn't like me picking on the lead designer, and he was trying to hold all of his employees to a higher standard, while he himself was not holding himself to a higher standard. So I was unfortunately suspended, and him suspending me definitely put Set 3's development way far back behind, just because I was one of the key people working on Set 3, and the time in which he suspended me set the game's development back a whole month, because he had to have somebody else redo the work that I was just about to be done with, but because he decided to suspend me, I wasn't able to finish, and the set's development was pushed back. And then right as my suspension period started, I see the new people coming in, and one of them was supposed to act more as my replacement, where he was supposed to work with me, but because I was no longer there due to the suspension, he was basically acting as my replacement, and he ended up leaving after working on the game for only like a month, and he just decided to quit because it wasn't in line with what he wanted out of his job. And then the other person who came in just started taking on more and more tasks, and he then became kind of like the community manager / pseudo face of the game, just because he was like the only one actually doing anything that was left around that could publicly do stuff. And when I say this person was doing everything, he was almost literally doing everything. He was running the events. He was running the community management. He was helping with design and development. He legitimately was doing almost everything. But Set 3 was a huge turning point for the game, both internally and externally. So, like, internally, we decided to cut ties with Cardamundi and stop working with them because all of their incompetence was definitely hurting the game. So we ended up switching over to the printing company that prints the Pokemon cards. So we started working with them for Set 3, and then with all of the internal changes, we also decided to change like the art direction and so many different minor aspects of the game that overall ended up benefiting the game. But at the same time, the game was in such a disarray state that like the damage for the most part was mostly done. Even though Set 3 was trying to turn things around, it wasn't good enough. But the set overall was a decently designed set in the end, and I don't exactly know how relatively successful it was, because towards the end of that is kind of like where I started falling off because of the suspension, and I was informed less and less on what was going on. So going into Set 4, I just have a little bit going into Set 4 because I was just able to look at it and give a little bit of feedback and do some initial draft testing. And soon after we started development on Set 4, I just was kind of done with the game, and I decided to leave. So I don't exactly know how well Set 4 did in the end or how well it was designed in the end. I just helped with a little bit at the beginning, and that was kind of it. So I don't necessarily regret my time I spent working on Argent Saga. I still learned a whole lot just internally on how trading card games are made, ran, and managed, and the different aspects that go into making a trading card game. So all of that knowledge is definitely still really, really valuable, and I don't regret working there just because designing and developing games is kind of like my passion. I really like making and developing games, and helping a trading card game along was definitely a really good experience for me overall, even though the work conditions and environments wasn't necessarily the best. So one day I want to eventually make my own card game, and I think using this type of a platform would be really interesting to see all of the things that I'm doing that are going into the game that I'm going to be making or would want to make. But ultimately, the big reasons why Argent Saga didn't do as well as it could have, there's just a whole bunch of different factors that took place. So between how my boss was running and managing the game to how he was received and reacting to the community was definitely a huge portion and factor of it. The game didn't have a super successful launch, and there wasn't as much continued hype to really keep the game afloat. The business practices and business models that we were playing around with were not sustainable in the long term. They were all more short term, and that definitely had a huge impact on the game. And then the pandemic also didn't help things just because, shutting down events was huge. And then on top of which, the sets just were not in the end very well designed. Like, they were fine, they were playable, like the game was still a good and exciting game. It's just that the level of power that we were playing with was also not very sustainable in the long run. That's why set 4 was also meant to be like a soft reboot where they're trying to dial things back. But regardless, the damage was already done from set 1, set 2, and set 3, that it kind of just didn't necessarily matter as much, although the game seemed like it was trying to turn itself around by set 3 and set 4, and it seemed like it started to, and it could have. It's just the pandemic kind of just halted all of that progress, and then the game just kind of fell into limbo during the whole pandemic period, and then my ex-boss just decided to end it at the beginning of this year. So there's just a lot that go into how a trading card game is made and ran, and there were just so many different levels that went wrong with this one, and even though I was a part of it, I definitely tried to do the best job that I possibly could to try to make the best product I possibly could out of the situations that I was put in. So this is kind of why I've been reacting to Digimon the way that I have been, is because like right now I can see that Digimon is in a way better position than Argent Saga ever could have hoped to be in, and I just think we need to calm down and level our expectations based on the current situation, because it is really hard to make and run a TCG. Like, people just need to understand that, and after working on a TCG, I definitely have a bit more understanding, and I have a bit more respect and patience for what the Digimon card game's current situation is. And I've been trying to express that we just need to be a little bit more patient, a little bit more calm, and a little bit more relaxed and understanding in order for it to do as well as it possibly can, especially in the current situation that it's facing. So in terms of the type of content that you're going to be seeing on this channel, I am still going to do a lot of Digimon content. I am going to try to wrap up some of the buddy fight content that I've been wanting to make, but I've been putting off for a while, so I eventually want to try to finish that up as well if possible. And then I also am thinking about making and creating my own game. So if anyone is interested in seeing what goes into some game development, then feel free to stick around to see that or express your interest in that. But for the most part, that's all I really have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below. Just as a quick reminder, I do have a TCG Player affiliate link, so anytime you use that link on checkout, some of the money will end up going to supporting me in the channel. And then I also design playmats over on Overcard Gamers on Facebook, so feel free to check out some of my playmats there as well. And then, as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I'll see you in the next video.